The rain was falling that night like the heavens themselves were weeping. In the small town of Blackridge, few people spoke James Barry's name without a lowered voice. He was, after all, just the janitor, a man invisible to those who considered themselves important. He pushed his broom down marble hallways polished not by his hands, but by the indifference of the powerful. But the truth? James Barry had been holding secrets powerful men would kill to keep buried. James was the kind of man you could walk past 100 times and never notice. Thin shoulders hunched from years of labor, shoes worn to the sole, his paycheck barely enough to keep his head above water. He lived in a one-bedroom apartment at the edge of town, where the wallpaper peeled and the ceiling leaked. To the wealthy elite of Blackridge, he was little more than a shadow, a background character in their glossy lives. But what they didn't know was that James was watching, listening, learning. Every night, as he swept the floors of the grand courthouse, James overheard the whispers. Deals made in shadows. Bribes exchanged under the table. Names spoken, names that were supposed to remain buried in locked drawers and sealed folders. And among those whispers, one name surfaced again and again, Councilman Richard Hale. A man adored by the public. A man with a smile as polished as the cufflinks he wore. A man who saw James Barry as nothing more than dirt beneath his shoes. James remembered the first time Richard Hale singled him out. It was during one of the councilman's late-night meetings. James had been mopping the floors quietly when Hale spilled his whiskey across the mahogany desk. Without a word of thanks, he barked at James to clean it up. But when James hesitated, just for a moment, Hale leaned close, his breath sharp with alcohol, and whispered, "Know your place, janitor. Men like me build this town. Men like you just clean up after us." The words stung. They cut deeper than any wound James had carried before. But he swallowed his pride, bowed his head, and kept working. That night, though, James promised himself something. He would not remain invisible forever. Weeks later, James stumbled across something that turned his world upside down. A folder, left carelessly inside the courthouse office Hale often used. He shouldn't have opened it. He knew that. But something compelled him, perhaps the years of humiliation, perhaps the aching hunger for justice. Inside were bank statements, offshore accounts, contracts signed in secrecy. Evidence of corruption that went deeper than James could have imagined. Land deals that stole from the poor, money funneled into pockets meant for public housing, hush payments to silence those who got too close. James realized he was holding a bomb, one that could destroy Hale's empire. But what he didn't know was that Hale already suspected him. On a stormy evening, James never made it home. His neighbors later recalled hearing a car screech in the alleyway, the echo of boots on wet pavement, and then, silence. James Barry's body was found the next morning, brutally beaten, left in the mud like discarded trash. The police, of course, called it a robbery gone wrong. Case closed. But the people who whispered in hushed tones knew better. They knew no common thief had silenced James. They knew the hands that struck him down belonged to someone higher, someone untouchable. And Richard Hale? He stood at James's funeral in a pressed black suit, a single white rose in his lapel, crocodile tears staining his cheeks. To the mourners, he spoke. James Barry was a good man, a hard-working man. This tragedy, it's a reminder that none of us are safe from senseless violence. But behind those glassy eyes, there was no sorrow, only victory. Or so Hale thought. You see, Richard Hale underestimated the one thing James Barry left behind. A secret envelope, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his shabby apartment. Inside were the documents, the proof of corruption, the names, the accounts, the contracts. But James had done something clever. He had marked the envelope with a single line of handwriting. If anything happens to me, the truth must come out. And that envelope didn't stay hidden for long. 1 week after James's murder, a journalist named Clara Finch received an anonymous package on her doorstep. Inside, Hale's entire empire laid bare. Clara was young, underestimated in her own right, often dismissed by her male colleagues as too emotional for investigative reporting. But when she saw James's note, she knew what she had to do. Clara published the first article within days. Then the second. Then the third. Each one more damning than the last. Hale's smiling face that once graced campaign posters now glared back from headlines with words like fraud, corruption, and murder cover-up. The town erupted. Protests filled the courthouse steps. The police could no longer turn a blind eye. And for the first time, Richard Hale felt something he had never felt before: fear. Because the man he had dismissed as a nobody, the janitor, the shadow, was the very man who brought his empire crashing down. Even in death, James Barry had outplayed him. The story of James Barry is not just about murder. It's about underestimation. About how the smallest voice, the most overlooked soul, can topple the mightiest tyrant. It's a reminder that arrogance blinds the powerful, while resilience empowers the meek. And in the end, James Barry did what few men dared to dream. He carved his name into history, not as a victim, but as a symbol of justice. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Richard Hale may have fallen from grace, but power rarely dies quietly. Rumors began to circulate that Hale still had allies, men willing to do whatever it took to silence the truth once more. Clara Finch began receiving threats. Her phone ringing at midnight with no one on the other end. Her car tires slashed in broad daylight. And then one evening, a note slid under her door. 5 words, scrawled in a hurried hand. You should have left it buried. The story of James Barry may have ended in the mud, but the war his death ignited? That is only just beginning. You want me to write part 2 as a continuation, where Clara becomes the new underdog, hunted by Hale's shadowy allies, and we build it into a tense investigative thriller? The note lay on Clara Finch's kitchen table, the ink still fresh enough to smudge. You should have left it buried. Her heart pounded as she read it over and over. Whoever had left it knew where she lived. Whoever had left it wanted her to stop digging. And deep down, Clara understood. She had become James Barry. The underdolls. James hadn't died so that the truth could be silenced again. In the weeks following her first explosive articles, Clara had watched the town of Blackridge turn upside down. Richard Hale had been arrested, his once smiling face replaced by the hollow eyes of a man cornered. But Hale was not just one man, he was the head of a serpent with many coils. There were others. Judges, businessmen, even police officers, all tied to the same corruption that James Barry had uncovered. And those men were still free. When the THG underestimated a target. But she also knew something. Irreets began. Clara tried to brush them off. The late night calls. The shadow she swore followed her car on lonely roads. But the note was different. The note wasn't a warning. It was a promise. 3 nights later, Clara left her newsroom after midnight. The rain-slicked streets glistened under the weak glow of the streetlights. She pulled her coat tighter and hurried toward her car. That's when she saw him. A man standing by her driver's side door, motionless, waiting. His face hidden beneath a hood, his hands stuffed in his pockets. Clara froze. Her breath caught in her throat. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer. He only tilted his head slightly, like a predator curious about its prey. Then, without warning, he pulled something from his pocket, metal glinting under the light. Clara dropped her bag and ran. Her footsteps splashed through puddles, echoing down the empty street. She didn't look back, didn't dare. Only when she reached the safety of a 24-hour diner 2 blocks away did she turn to see he was gone. But when she returned with the police, she found something tucked beneath her windshield wiper. A photograph. James Barry's body, the night it was found. Clara's hands shook as she stared at the image. Whoever these men were, they wanted to remind her what happened to people who got too close. But fear has a way of sharpening resolve. Clara realized she couldn't fight this alone. She needed help. That's when she met Detective Marcus Doyle. Doyle was an outsider, transferred into Blackridge after whispers of corruption tainted the local police. He was rough around the edges, grizzled, but he had something Clara recognized instantly, a hatred for injustice that burned hotter than fear. When Clara showed him the folder James Barry had left behind, Doyle leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "You don't know what you've got here," he said. "This isn't just about Hale. This goes deeper. Much deeper." Clara swallowed. "Then help me finish what James started." Together, Clara and Doyle began tracing the threads James had uncovered. Offshore accounts, shell companies, fake charities. But every time they pulled one thread, another name surfaced. Names that carried weight. Names that shouldn't be touched. The corruption wasn't limited to Blackridge, it stretched across the state, into politics, into law enforcement. The more Clara dug, the more dangerous it became. She was no longer writing just about a corrupt councilman. She was exposing an empire. And that empire wanted her gone. One evening, Clara returned home to find her apartment door slightly ajar. Panic surged through her chest. She reached for her phone, dialing Doyle with trembling fingers. "Don't go inside," he ordered. "I'm on my way." But Clara couldn't wait. Slowly, carefully, she pushed the door open. Her apartment looked untouched. Nothing missing. Nothing broken. Except for one thing. On her kitchen counter lay a tape recorder. The play button already pressed down. Static hissed for a moment before a man's voice crackled through. "Calm. Cold. You don't know what you're walking into, Miss Finch." James Barry didn't understand the rules. Don't make his mistake. Stop now, or you'll join him. The tape clicked off. Clara stood frozen, her blood running cold. For the first time, she realized just how close the enemy was. But the threats, the fear, they had the opposite effect of what the men intended. Instead of silencing Clara, they lit a fire in her. She thought of James Barry, the man who had lived invisible, who had been beaten into the mud for daring to expose the truth. She thought of how Hale had stood at his funeral, pretending to mourn while his hands dripped with guilt. James hadn't lived to see justice. But Clara would. "I won't stop," she whispered, clutching the tape recorder. "Not until every one of you falls." Clara's next article was her most explosive yet. It named not just Richard Hale but 2 judges and a police captain, linking them directly to the corruption network. The story spread like wildfire, drawing national attention. But that night, as Clara sat alone in her apartment, she noticed something chilling. Across the street, a single car sat idling. Its headlights off. Its silhouette unmoving. Watching. Her phone buzzed with a new message. No name, no number. Just 6 words that made her blood run cold. James Barry was only the beginning. Clara's breath caught. She realized the war she had stepped into wasn't just about one man's murder. It was about an entire system built on lies, greed, and violence. And they weren't finished with her yet. The car across the street didn't move. Its engine hummed quietly, like a predator waiting for its prey to stumble into reach. Clara Finch stood frozen by her window, her phone still glowing with the chilling message. James Barry was only the beginning. Her instinct told her to call Detective Doyle, but something deeper stirred inside her. If she was being watched, if they were closing in, then she had to move now, before it was too late. The days that followed blurred into paranoia and urgency. Clara and Doyle doubled their efforts, working out of borrowed basements and safe houses. Every file James Barry had collected was dissected, cross-checked, and published piece by piece. The public roared with outrage. Protests spread beyond Blackridge. The state attorney general announced a sweeping investigation. One by one, the names in James's folder began to topple. Judges, police captains, business tycoons. But still, the men in the shadows weren't done. Every step forward came with a counterstrike. A brake line cut on Doyle's car, a threatening letter slipped under Clara's door, rumors planted to discredit her reporting. And yet, through it all, Clara felt something nagging at her. A detail she couldn't shake. Why had James Barry, a janitor, risked everything to collect evidence this damning? Why him? Why would a man invisible to the world dig into a monster like Richard Hale in the first place? The answer came one rainy night when Doyle slid an old file across the table. "Thought you should see this," he said, his voice low. Inside was James Barry's personnel record. But beneath the mundane notes, employment dates, performance reviews, was a name Clara had never seen before. Margaret Barry, James's sister. A social worker who had once led a campaign against Hale's land deals. According to the file, she had vanished 15 years earlier. No trace. No explanation. Just gone. Clara's chest tightened. James hadn't been an accidental whistleblower. He had been seeking justice for someone the system had already erased. His sister. And suddenly, everything made sense. James hadn't been fighting for himself. He had been fighting for her. Armed with this revelation, Clara and Doyle went public again, this time revealing not just corruption, but the decades-old disappearances tied to Hale's empire. Young activists, union leaders, whistleblowers, all silenced, just like Margaret Berry. The articles set fire to the state. The FBI stepped in. Arrests piled up. Hale's allies scattered like rats fleeing a sinking ship. But victory came with a cost. One night, Doyle didn't show up at their safe house. Clara called. No answer. Hours later, his phone was found smashed in an alley. And then, Clara's laptop lit up with a live feed. Doyle, bound to a chair, a bruised face, and a voice off camera saying, "End this now, Miss Finch, or his blood is on your hands." Clara's heart shattered. This was the trap. The final card the Shadow Network had left to play. She thought of James Berry, beaten and left in the mud. She thought of Margaret, silenced before her story could ever be told. And she thought of Doyle, a man who had risked everything to help her. Her choice was impossible. Publish the final piece of evidence and doom Doyle. Or stay silent and let the truth die. Clara's hands shook as she hovered over her keyboard. Tears blurred her vision. But in the end, she whispered the same words James Berry had once written on his envelope. "If anything happens to me, the truth must come out." And she hit publish. The story exploded across every major outlet within hours. The footage, the documents, the names, it was all there. An empire of corruption exposed in one final, devastating blow. By morning, federal agents had raided the remaining strongholds. Hale's allies were dragged out in handcuffs. The Shadow Network collapsed under the weight of its own secrets. But Clara's victory was not without heartbreak. Doyle was never found. His disappearance became another name on the long list of sacrifices made in pursuit of justice. The story of James Berry ended not in the mud where his body was discarded, but in the firestorm his courage ignited. A janitor who had been treated like nothing became the spark that burned down an empire. And Clara Finch, an underestimated young journalist, proved that even in the face of threats, fear and loss, truth cannot be buried forever. But the lesson was not without irony. For in exposing the darkness, Clara had also inherited James Berry's curse, to live knowing that justice always demands a price. Months later, Clara stood at James Berry's grave. The rain fell softly, just as it had on the night he died. She laid a single white flower down and whispered, "They thought you were invisible, but you changed everything." As she turned to leave, a man in a hood passed her on the path. He didn't speak. He didn't look up. But in his hand, he carried a small slip of paper. Clara's stomach dropped when she saw it fall to the ground. She picked it up. 3 words, scrawled in jagged handwriting. "It's not over." Her pulse quickened. Because deep down, Clara knew the truth James Berry had died for wasn't fully buried yet. The serpent had been wounded, yes, but some monsters never die. And somewhere in the shadows of Blackridge, the war for truth was still raging.